Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our virtual talk today. We do have a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We do ask that you please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker will be happy to address questions or comments at the end of the program. In addition, yes?
No, excuse me, we're fine.
Oh, okay. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end as well. Please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. And if you would like to rewatch this talk or previous virtual talks, please check out our Facebook page. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Miss Eleanor Merrill, who's a docent with the Timken. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Eleanor.
Thanks, Tiffany. Well, greetings and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. As Tiffany said, my name is Eleanor Merrill, and I'm a docent with the museum, and delighted to be with you for today's tour on the topic of early Netherlandish paintings. So the term early Netherlandish art generally applies to painters active during the 15th and 16th centuries in the northern European areas controlled by the Dukes of Burgundy. These artists became an early driving force behind the Northern Renaissance and the movement away from the international Gothic style, which in the 15th century developed in two directions. Both could be called revolutionary. One was in the south, in Florence, and was the birth of the Italian Renaissance, which you probably all know. But the other took place in the north, in the Low Countries, where painting went through an independent but equally radical transformation. And this was the beginning of the Northern Renaissance. The enormously wealthy Dukes of Burgundy were the most important patrons of the early Northern Renaissance, but newly wealthy private citizens also commissioned art. Like Florence in Italy, cities in Northern Europe like Bruges and Ghent and later Antwerp and Brussels were rich industrial and banking centers during the period. And they allowed a large merchant class to flourish, creating an ideal environment for artistic production. So in Italy, the Renaissance was deeply influenced by the art and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. And in part, this was because the art and architecture of antiquity was really available, immediately available to people. There were plenty of ruins around. So you have Michelangelo's David. Northern Europe, however, didn't have such ready access to ancient monuments. And so it tended to draw instead more directly from medieval traditions, which after about 1380 conveyed new levels of realism, perspective, and skill in rendering color, peaking with the Limburg brothers and their manuscript illuminations. Here we have images of a couple of pages from manuscript illuminations called the Très Richer de Duc de Berry. And it's the most famous and possibly the best surviving example of manuscript illumination in the late phase of the International Gothic style. It's a book of hours, which is a collection of prayers to be said at the canonical hours. On the left is the page for January, showing the household of John, Duke of Berry, exchanging New Year's gifts. The Duke is seated at the right in blue. The Limburgs developed a more naturalistic mode of representation, evidenced in their depiction of people and their surroundings, as seen in the page for the month of May on the right. Now, one of the most important aspects of early Netherlandish art is its role in the introduction of oil painting into the European arts. Remember that tempera had been the medium used up until this time, and when it dries, it's very matte and opaque. We see this in Michelangelo's frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and you see that on the right-hand image. The use of oil as a medium allowed artists a great deal more manipulation of paint. They employed a new level of virtuosity, mainly from taking advantage of the fact that oil dries very slowly. This gave artists more time and more scope for blending and mixing layers of different pigments, techniques developed by Jan van Eyck, and quickly adopted and refined by both Robert Campin and Roger van der Weyden. These three artists are considered the first rank and most influential of the early generation of early Netherlandish painters, and they had a common goal: to make the painted image vividly present and to render the unseen palpable. Now, you only need to know one artist to understand what early Netherlandish art was all about, and that's Jan van Eyck. And he lived from about 1390 to 1441. He was a revolutionary painter whose discoveries were felt from the very beginning to represent something entirely new. He reinvented what his craft at the highest level could do. More than any other artist, he made painting into the ultimate art. Van Eyck was among the first artists to produce a substantial body of secular portraiture of aristocratic and middle-class patrons in Northern Europe. And this was a genre formerly reserved for the ruling members of society. Only they'd had portraits. So not only was Van Eyck's portraiture highly detailed, but he also innovated a posture now taken for granted, which is the three-quarter view. Of his extant portraits, and there aren't, the work of Van Eyck, we don't have many works available to us. This painting, Portrait of a Man, is the most prized, and there's a general consensus that it represents another new genre, the self-portrait. No other portraits of Jan van Eyck survive to confirm his appearance, but the painting looks like a self-portrait. The sitter is craning forward slightly, as if looking in a mirror, and the piercing blue eyes gaze in slightly different directions, as if the artist were concentrating on each in turn. Emerging from a dark background, the sitter gazes out intensely. His clothing, which is that of a prosperous individual, but not a member of the upper nobility, would have been appropriate for Van Eyck. His family were members of the gentry, and he himself was paid a handsome salary as court painter to Philip the Good, who was the Duke of Burgundy. He's wearing a dark, fur-lined robe, but it's his eye-catching red headgear that steals the show. It kind of resembles a turban, but it's actually a typical 15th century piece of headwear, which is called a chaperon. And it has a decorative tail, which the sitter has wrapped in a fabulously complex and exuberant fashion, creating deep folds and a powerful sculptural effect. So here's another of his portraits from 1430, and it shows the chaperone as it's normally worn. Some historians suggest that Van Eyck wrapped up his chaperone as a turban to keep the tails out of his way when he painted. The subject in this painting looks particularly serious, just as in most of Van Eyck's other single portrait paintings. This type of composition was also common, where the view would go below the shoulder length down to the waist, allowing the hands to be included, and perhaps symbolic items alongside them. So here, the artist makes use of a ring in the man's right hand, which he appears to be offering, perhaps for sale or perhaps as a gift. Maybe a serious look suggests he's working in a professional capacity as a jeweler, but it's hard to be sure. Another aspect of the painting consistent with Van Eyck's other portraits is that lighting is used very abruptly. There's near darkness across the background and around the subject's torso, with his own outfit being also deliberately dark and merging with the background. The light is lavishly applied to his face, the blue chaperon, and his hands, suggesting the ring he holds may have been significant. So back to what may be our self-portrait. Van Eyck's use of limited colors and the intense contrast between the brightly lit face and the dark background really make for a very arresting image. It seems as if the sitter is turning away from a strong light from the left and towards us. Although it looks astonishingly natural, Van Eyck has played with the proportions of both the face and the body to achieve this dramatic impact. The sitter's shoulders are narrow and sloping, and the head is enlarged so that it dominates the composition. And look at the unsparing way Van Eyck's represented himself. If you look very closely, you can see his beard that's begun to grow, and you see it's a stubble. And the red veins in his eyes, perhaps from close looking at himself. Notice the wrinkles, the sagging skin, the beginning of the way the cheeks are dropping on either side of his face. Another remarkable feature of this portrait is that it's kept its original frame. And on the top edge of the frame, Van Eyck has appended his motto, which is, quote, "as I can," end quote, in Greek. Now, "as I can" is from a motto that scribes often put at the end of a manuscript they'd copied, which would have been a little bit longer. It would have said, quote, "as I can, not as I would," end quote, which means this is the best I can do. I wish I could do better. It's sort of a humble thing to say, but Van Eyck hasn't taken the words "I wish I could do better" part of this text. He just said "as I can," which seems anything but humble, especially as the "I" in the middle of the phrase can be a kind of play on Van Eyck's name, "as I can," "as Eyck can." It thus seems as though Van Eyck is showing off here what he can do. One art historian has suggested that this is a kind of portfolio piece, a showpiece, that the artist would use as a way to sell his abilities to potential patrons. Maybe he's saying, you can compare this painting to my own face. Here I am standing before you. Here's the painting, and this is how real I can paint. While Van Eyck inscribed his motto on several other works, it's far larger here and more prominent than anywhere else. In addition, he posted it on the upper part of the frame, which in other portraits that have survived by him was usually the place where he inscribed his sitter's name. So here it seems that the motto could stand for the sitter's identity, suggesting again that we have a self-portrait. Despite Van Eyck's fame, most of his biography remains shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that his family were members of the gentry, they were well off, and he was sought after by the most brilliant patrons of his day, including the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, for whom he was appointed court painter and chamberlain around 1425. And he remained in Philip's service until his death in Bruges in 1441. The sophistication of Van Eyck's iconography, which demonstrates understanding of complicated theological arguments, does suggest that he had received a high level of education. Along with Van Eyck, Robert Campin, also known as the Master of Flamel, was among the first rank and influential of the early generation of early Netherlandish paintings. And the triptych known as the Marode altarpiece is one of the most significant works of Campin's atelier. The central panel, one of the earliest examples of an Annunciation placed in a domestic interior. Taking its name from the aristocratic Marode family of Belgium, who owned it during the 19th century, this masterpiece of Christian art from the Northern Renaissance consists of 3 panel paintings. In other words, it's a triptych format. The left panel depicts the donor and his wife. The central and most important panel shows the Annunciation and its 2 main characters, Mary and the Archangel Gabriel. The right panel portrays Joseph in his workshop. Now, the triptych is relatively small, measuring roughly 4 feet in width by about 2 feet high. And so it was designed as a private devotional piece for use in the home. The most radical feature of this triptych is its domestic setting. Reflecting perhaps the teachings of the Franciscan order, whose monks took care to interpret the Bible in terms that their listeners understood and could relate to, an approach which was especially popular in Northern Europe. Campin amplifies the domestic nature of the scene and keeps religious conventions and formalities at a minimum. So neither Mary nor the Archangel wear halos. There's no dove to represent the Holy Ghost. Instead, Campin places Mary in a comfortable, well-sized room, along with a table, a bench running the length of one wall, windows, and fireplace. Even so, the Annunciation scene is filled with symbols of theological importance. Above Gabriel's wings, a tiny naked figure of a child, symbolizing the body and soul of Jesus, is being transported on 7 golden rays of light from one of the living room windows. He carries across a somber reminder of his sacrificial destiny. Now, the table, which sits between Mary and Gabriel, is rather jarring in the scene. While much of the painting has amazing realism and detail, the perspective of the room, as you can see, is off. Most notably, the table just isn't foreshortened properly, and it leaves the viewer feeling like the room is tipped, making it feel unstable. Now, some have said that this lack of perspective was intentional, as it serves the symbolic purpose of visually detaching the religious realm from the world of the viewers. Perhaps the unsettling element is meant to clue the viewer into the fact that in this moment, All of history is being disrupted, tilted, and changed. We're meant to feel unsettled as God enters into the human narrative in a transformative, revolutionary way. Others say that the artist simply hadn't mastered the use of perspective, or this was simply a way to make things on it look closer, more available to the viewer. You, of course, can decide which side of the debate you fall on. Now, the tabletop has 16 sides, which references the 16 most important prophets of the Old Testament. As Jesus will be the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, it's fitting that they're represented in an Annunciation scene. A book and a scroll together reference the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament, which is the scroll, tells why a Messiah is needed and provides prophecies about Christ's coming. The New Testament tells of Christ and the plan for mankind's salvation. The pages of the New Testament are ruffled by the breeze that the angel's arrival has caused. The recently extinguished candle may be an allusion to either the sudden entrance of an invisible presence like the Holy Ghost, or the idea that the light emitted by the candle flame is no match for Christ's divine radiance. On the left wing, the kneeling donor appears to witness the central scene through the open door. His wife kneels next to him, and a town messenger stands at the garden gate in back. These two figures were added later, following the donor's marriage. The owners would have purchased the triptych to use in private prayer. An image of Christ's conception in an interior not unlike the one in which they lived also may have reinforced the hope for their own children. And in the right wing, Joseph, who's betrothed to the Virgin, works in his carpenter's shop, drilling holes in a board. The mousetraps on the bench and in the shop window opening onto the street are thought to allude to references in the writings of St. Augustine, identifying the cross as the devil's mousetrap. And notice the saw in the bottom left of the panel. It's believed to reference the sword that the Apostle Peter will use to slice the ear off of a Roman soldier on the night Jesus is arrested. The other tools spread throughout the workspace are references to other moments of the Passion narrative. Campion related his ideas in colors, whose depth and richness shone with incomparable luminosity. Nothing like it had been seen before. And his novel techniques, which were shared with Jan van Eyck, produced an exceptional result. His intensity of view, the sensation of sparkling color eclipsed anything previously achievable in tempera. I had the good fortune many years ago to see this work in person, and it really is quite amazing. Now, in contrast to Campion's Annunciation is Van Eyck's depiction from 1434 or 1436. And we don't know who commissioned this work or where it was originally installed, but most likely it was the left-hand section of a three-part altarpiece, whose other panels are sadly now lost. It's regarded as one of the most complex paintings, rich in symbolism and iconography, not to mention stylistic detail that makes it appear almost photographic. So here we have again the Archangel Gabriel, who's delivering a salutation from God. And his words in Latin say, "Hail, full of grace." And notice that the words flow out in gold letters. Mary draws back with surprise and modesty, and she's been chosen to bear the Son of God. As she speaks her acceptance, "Behold, the handmaiden of the Lord," is written in reverse for God to see. The dove of the Holy Spirit descends to her on rays of light. For Christian believers, this is the very instant of the incarnation, when Word is made flesh and Jesus is given earthly life, and when God's plan for salvation is set in motion. The setting of the scene within a church is significant, and this is new. Van Eyck appears to have been the first panel painter to locate the Annunciation inside a church. Both the ecclesiastical setting and the overlarge size of the Virgin within it help identify the church with the person of Mary. For all its highly convincing evocation of the material world, however, virtually every element in this painting carries complex levels of meaning. Van Eyck's elaborate symbolism, which would have been fully grasped only by a small, well-educated elite, centers on the implications of the Annunciation as the transition to the new era of grace brought about by Christ's human birth and sacrifice. The light that streams in from the window at the upper left takes the form of 7 golden rays. The dove of the Holy Spirit descends along the longest of these. Now, the number 7, and we saw the same 7 lines in the prior painting, the Marot altarpiece. The number 7 refers to the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit from the book of Isaiah. The gifts being wisdom, understanding, counsel, strength, knowledge, purity, and fear. In addition to the divine light from above, a naturalistic light illuminates the scene from the right. The single stained glass window at the top of the back wall contains a depiction of the Lord and contrasts with the 3 lead-shot windows behind the Virgin, reinforcing the passage from the Jewish concept of one God to the Christian concept of the Trinity. That the figure of the Lord in the stained glass window stands atop a globe may refer to his words in Isaiah 66, 1, and I quote, "Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool," end of quote. Now remember this because we'll have reason to reference it again. Both figures are elaborately dressed. Mother Mary wears a blue dress symbolic of divinity with ermine trim. Ermine, of course, was used for royal garments, which suggests Mother Mary's royalty. Archangel Gabriel wears a similarly styled robe, but it's much more lavish, decorated in patterns and large jewels. He also wears a crown and holds a staff in his left hand with his right finger pointing upwards. His garments suggest that he's taking part in or celebrating High Mass. The difference in clothing between the two creates a contrast, indicating that Archangel Gabriel is from heaven and Mother Mary appears more plain, suggestive of the contrast of heaven and earth. Interestingly, Mary's facial features are believed to resemble that of Isabella of Portugal. And remember, she was Philip the Good's wife, in whose court Van Eyck was employed. So that may well be. Gabriel's wings are depicted in a variety of colors reminiscent of a rainbow. The rainbow becomes a powerful symbol of cleansing and purification, strong themes from biblical narratives. And this is the only Annunciation scene where Jan van Eyck gave Gabriel rainbow wings that appeared in this manner. The wings also look like peacock feathers, which are symbolic of immortality. Now, in the bottom right corner of the composition are a book, a bunch of lilies, and a footstool. The book is suggested to be the book of Isaiah, but it can also hint at Mary's studious nature. The lilies represent purity and are also symbols of Christ. And here again, we see the number 7 in the 7 open lilies. And remember the single stained glass window behind Mary in which God stands on a globe of the world, referring to the Bible verse in Isaiah, "Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool." The floor, which appears as tiles, depicts various scenes from the Old Testament, including stories of Samson and the story of David and Goliath. Notice the zodiac signs, which are a common addition on floors of pavement of medieval cathedrals, like the one suggested in this painting. They point to God's rule of the whole universe, including all things related to astrology, as well as suggesting chaos before the advent of Christ. Finally, a note on perspective. The figures appear larger in size than what would be mathematically in proportion to the surrounding architecture, possibly highlighting the figure's importance. So it's 1435, and Roger van der Weyden, the third great early Netherlandish painter, leaves his French birthplace for Tournai, where he'd been Robert Campion's apprentice, and he embarked on a new life in Brussels. And one of his early works at a pivotal time in his career was when he received a commission from the Crossbowmen's Guild to paint an altar triptych. And his work, The Deposition of Christ, is a self-conscious attempt to create a masterpiece that would establish him with an international reputation. Van der Weyden and the Van Eyck brothers constituted two very different camps in Flemish painting. The latter's mastery of Gothic miniaturism produced their meticulous rendering of every detail and their illusory depiction of perspective, while any emotions, and never any untoward emotions, played only a supporting role. But Van der Weyden, by contrast, although also a consummate detailist, would be the most dramatic of all the Flemish artists. He fully intends this picture to be a masterpiece showcasing his idea of what painting is, and a new beauty ideal based on the transmission of feelings. The moving beauty of seeing others who are moved. No artist has ever imbued this scene with more majestic pathos than Van der Weyden. It's like a great sculptured frieze. The holy mourners spread across the surface of the painting. Christ and his mother echo the same position in the painting. He falls from the cross physically dead. She falls to the ground emotionally dead. And there's much of the sculptural about the painting. Van der Weyden, who survived the Black Death, which was raging in his native Tournai in 1400, was heavily influenced by the funereal statues and carvings he saw growing up. It's also supposed that his apprenticeship with Robert Campion began with instruction in sculpture, and this influence remained with him. Van der Weyden positioned Christ's body in the T-shape of a crossbow to reflect the commission from the Leuven Guild of Archers, and Mary's dangling arms and Christ's drooping figure also form the shape of a crossbow. And as an homage to and a marker of the Guild's patronage, we see these two small crossbows that hang from the tracery in the corner of the panel. Christ's body is being lowered from the cross by three men. The old man behind Christ is probably Nicodemus, a Pharisee and ruler of the Jews. The youth, apparently a servant, holds two viciously long and blood-stained nails removed from Christ's hands. He's managed not to get bloodstains on his wife's scarf, his white hose, or his pale blue damask robe. The figure wearing a gold robe is probably Joseph of Arimathea, the rich man who donated his own tomb for Christ's body. Christ's body here shows no signs of the flagellation he endured before being crucified. All we see are the nail wounds in his hands and feet, and where he was stabbed on his side. This side wound between his ribs, however, is palpably deep. The crown on his head is a hideous braid of grayish-green rosebush thorns, still painfully driven into his forehead and left ear. And just take a look at the damask fabric and fur on Arimathea's robe. You can feel the texture. Moving from the left, the Virgin is sustained by St. John the Evangelist, youngish and barefoot, as was customary in most Christian iconography. His left foot treads on the Virgin Mary's cloak as he lunges to soften her fall. Although his eyes continue to stream with emotion, his face is set in a numb expression of absolute sadness and sorrow. The pigment used for the crimson tunic was made from one of the most expensive ingredients available, kermes dye, which you probably know is extracted from dried red bodies of the female scale insect. He's assisted by a woman in green who's probably Mary Salome, the Virgin's half-sister and John's mother. The woman behind her may be Mary Cleophas, the Virgin's other half-sister. Notice the skull of Adam on the ground, and the depiction of tears in this work is miraculous. It's said that it was Roger van der Weyden who invented the tears that flow down the cheeks of his grieving mourners in Sins of the Passion, imploring the compassion of the viewer. The emotionally charged figure of Mary Magdalene closes the painting on the right. She embodies the tragedy of having witnessed the death of he who had saved her from public execution for adultery by daring her persecutors, and I quote, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," end quote. Her elbows raised high, her fingers tightly clasped under her chin in a gesture of prayer, her purple cape slipped off, exposing her bare décolleté. The trauma evident in her pose leads us to believe she's about to fall at the feet of Christ, those same feet she had once so lovingly anointed with oil and dried with her own hair, and that are now bloodied and dead. Roger de la Pasture was born in 1399 in Tournai, one of the principal towns of France, but an enclave in the territories of the Duke of Burgundy. He lived in Tournai and in Brussels, where his name was translated into Dutch as Roger van der Weyden, and where he died on June 18, 1464. He was highly successful in his lifetime, and his paintings were exported to Italy and Spain, receiving commissions from, amongst others, Philip the Good, Netherlandish nobility, and foreign princes. His surviving works consist mainly of religious triptychs, altarpieces, and commissioned single and diptych portraits. We'll close our tour today with a work by Petrus Christus, an admirer and follower of Jan van Eyck and the leading painter in Bruges after his death in 1441. It used to be thought that Christus was a pupil of Van Eyck, but scholars now believe that there was in fact little or no personal contact between the two. Be that as it may, Christus was a worthy successor to Van Eyck's legacy. The work I want to show a goldsmith in his shop is unique because it's sometimes referred to as the first major secular painting in Netherlandish art. And here we have a view into a goldsmith stall where a fashionably dressed couple chooses a wedding ring, conveys a sense, and this conveys a sense of the opulent world of 15th century burghers. The goldsmith is depicted dressed in the garb of a common craftsman, seated in his workshop in the company of two elegantly attired people who seem to be negotiating business with him. The man and women are evidently a couple, and their sumptuous and fashionable clothing mark them either as members of the court of the Duke of Burgundy or the few wealthy burghers who were able to mix with the aristocracy. A red wedding girdle lighting on the counter confirms that they're betrothed or engaged, and the ring in the goldsmith's scales is likely to be a wedding ring that they're inspecting. Oddly, however, the goldsmith's attention isn't focused on the scales, nor on the couple, but of something off to the side towards the source of light out of sight. The main figure in this enigmatic painting was long identified as Saint Eligius, the patron saint of goldsmiths, due to the presence of a halo, which was recognized as a later addition by a less skillful hand, and therefore it was removed. The panel is likely actually an advertisement for the goldsmith, and this was known as a vocational painting, which it portrays the profession of goldsmithing and perhaps a specific goldsmith. It's been suggested that the goldsmith is Wilhelm van Vleuten, who worked in Bruges for Philip the Good. Since the painting is signed and dated by the artist in white paint in the center foreground, it can firmly be placed in the year 1449. This is the year that King James II of Scotland married Mary of Guelders. The Duke of Burgundy, who was also a renowned patron of the arts in Bruges, commissioned the goldsmith William van Vleuten to make the couple a gift for their wedding. The diversity of finely crafted objects at the right serves as an advertisement, as we said, for the Goldsmiths Guild, included a raw material of the trade and finished products such as brooches, rings, and a belt buckle. The convex mirror, which links the pictorial space to the street, reflects two young men with a falcon, which was a symbol of pride and greed, and establishes a moral comparison between the imperfect world of the viewer and the world of virtue and balance. Christus's use of the mirror to create this trick of perspective enables the viewer to simultaneously see what lies before him or her, which is the goldsmith, and what lies behind, the falconer and the city. This painting is quite a fine example of how much artwork can tell us. And, you know, if only we know where to look. And I hope I was able to engender a greater appreciation for you as to the significance of these details which bring a painting alive. I'd like to close our tour today with a quote by Ingres, and I quote, Details perform an essential role in classical painting. To engage the spectator as they contemplate them is to touch their soul. End of quote. So I hope you enjoyed taking a look at these works, which 6 centuries later, quite amazing, still enthrall and intrigue us. And I welcome any comments or questions you may have. Thank you all.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that talk. And we will go ahead and open it up for questions. So feel free to unmute yourself or add them into the chat, and we will definitely take a couple minutes to answer them. And it looks like in the chat, we do have some comments about some technical difficulties with viewing the slideshow, which we'll definitely make sure to take a look at that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Looks like the bottom part is cut off. I apologize for that. I do apologize for that. I did not obviously see this message, so I didn't correct that, and I apologize.
Okay, and then if there are no questions, we will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again, Eleanor. And then if you would like to know more about our upcoming events, please check out the events page on our website. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you can join us again for our next virtual talk, which will be Thursday, August 10th. And that is entitled, "What's Controversial About the Portrayals of the Last Supper?" So once again, thank you, Miss Eleanor, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. And bye, everyone.